thanks for that introduction, and it's so great to be here. Yeah, my name is Pocock. I used to have the name that I had this pronounced twice and spelled once for everybody, but now everybody, especially oarsmen, know the name, so I'm pleased about that. So, I will ask, here's the book. How many of you have read the book? All right, that's a lot. How many have rowed? High school, college, they're recreational? How many have rowed in a Pocock wooden boat? All right, there we go. Half a dozen. Fantastic. We have one, my brother and I. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So I am the grandson of Dick Pocock, and I am the great nephew of George Pocock, my great uncle. Two boat builders who came over from England and separated in 1921. I'll tell you that story. My grandfather came to New Haven to build boats for Yale. That's how our family got to the East Coast. And together they built every Olympic-winning eight-oared boat from 1920 to 1956. Gold medal, United States, unsurpassed, I think, record. So this is the finish of the race, the book portrays. Of course, that's the U.S., University of Washington, and I'm wearing my UW sweatshirt here. My Boys in the Boat logo. So, glad it was clean in the closet today. So that's the win up there. It's quite a race, and they beat Italy by 0.6 of a second and Germany by 1 full second. So that was quite a finish.
Which is which, Jim?
Germany's closest to us.
Thank you.
The next slide is a little less than 2-minute video, which I just found. And this is of George Pocock talking about the wood and building a single shell. And Steve helped me put this in here, so I'll do this. But what I'm going to do after that is I'm just going to tell you the history of the Pocock brothers. They're growing up, they're learning to build shells, they're learning to row, they're coming to the U.S. A bit of the history of rowing here. Got a few stories. All right.
3 pounds. How long is it? 26.
That's me.
Yeah, I'm trying to, this is not my computer, so I'm trying to turn up the sound.
To the right of me.
To the right of me.
Sometimes
Try this thing again, if I can.
Hit it a couple times. Oops.
All right.
3 pounds. How long is it? 26 feet. And look at that wood, brother. You've almost got to work. Years it took to grow. And you know, you look at it and you see some years that it almost perished. Sometimes there'd be hardly a grain, that it practically was inert, didn't grow at all. And then moisture came again and away she went. There's a sense of fulfillment when you build a good boat, looking at it, a sense of fulfillment, of good craftsmanship. I don't care whether it's rowing, or whether it's skiing, or what. You've got to acquire a technique to fulfill that sense of good craftsmanship.
All right. Quite a little clip. Well, this is a picture of a guy I call Uncle George. He's a guy who was he was a very modest man. He didn't like having his picture taken. And this is a famous picture. If you Google his name, this is the first picture that will come up. And he was being interviewed, and the reporter asked him a penetrating question. And to conceive of his answer, he just looked down the keel of this boat he was building, and the photographer snapped this picture. So that's he died in 1976. I was 22 at the time. I knew him all those years. He died at 86 years old. This is a picture of, this is my great-grandfather, 5 kids. There's not a wife in this picture. George is in the back, in the middle. My grandfather Dick is in the back. And also in the back is Lucy, their older sister. Their oldest sister is Julia in the front. And then a half-sister, Kat. Fred had 3 wives die. In fact, George's, the mother of the 4 of them, died shortly after childbirth with George. And so this guy essentially, he was a journeyman boat builder. And a journeyman meant exactly that. You journeyed wherever there was work. So he would go up and down the Thames building boats and trying to raise 5 kids. Lucy, I just want to go into a thing about her. She's a couple of years older than the boys. She was the British national champion woman oarsman in 1912. And this is after her race. Look at that getup she had to row in. Sweater, big long skirt. The guy helping her out of the boat was a coxswain. She had to haul that guy around too. So here she won the boat. And this is just to give you an idea of rowing. 26,000 people came out and stood on the banks of the Thames to watch this race. Okay? So this talks about the popularity of rowing at the turn of the century. This is a picture of the boathouse in Eton on Thames. And I put this picture in because this is where Fred Pocock built boats. He had a job. He was the head of the boat building and the maintenance of the boats of Eton College. And as you probably know, that's a fancy prep school in England for the sons of royalty. And it's basically up behind this picture off to the right. And all the boys of Eton needed to be able to row a single by the time they graduated. So there were over 300 singles in the shop, and Fred had to maintain those. But another reason I put this in is I told you he was a widower, had to take care of these kids, succession of housekeepers that could never pay them very much, so they would always one after another. And for quite a bit of time, they lived. See that bow window there, the white one in the front. That was a window in the house. They lived right there, facing to the work. This is another picture of just a little bit of a different shot. But you think these 2 brothers were born in 1889 and 1891. Cars weren't there, trucks weren't there. Basically, any kind of transportation was horse and carriage, or it was livery on the water. So oarsmen would row barges. They'd be the taxi cab, they'd be the liveryman. And there were singles that had a seat in the back, and you flagged down a boat to go where you wanted to go. All the commerce was on the water. And so what these boys learned as they were growing up was what they called the Thames waterman stroke. And my grandfather would describe it often as the maximum amount of effect for the minimum amount of effort. And they would then describe it in pages or long. But that was the simple way to say it. And that's what these boys grew up around, the whole family. The camera would be just turned completely around, and you're looking across at Windsor, across this bridge, and that's Windsor Castle. So that's where King Charlie hangs out. And, these right across. And it's of interest to me because my grandmother grew up about a mile from Windsor Castle on Windsor, and my grandparents courted over this bridge. When they came to America, the 2 brothers came to America in 1911. It took them until about 1918 really to get established, 1917. And they were engaged that whole time, but that's when he sent for her. So they were separated by an ocean for 5 or 6 years at least. This is George. Now there's an official apprenticeship for boat builders. They were apprenticed to their father when they were 15 years old. And that apprenticeship lasts about 6 years before you become a full-fledged boat builder. They were taught by their father how to row, starting about age 12. And the Thames waterman stroke. And they were very good at this is a picture of George when he was 17 years old. His father told him, this is 2 years into his apprenticeship, his father said, I'm going to enter you into this race, and it's on the Thames, part of the river that you don't know, and I want you to build your own boat. And the only words I'm going to give you is nobody is going to ask how long it takes you to build it, they will just ask who built it. And so he built a boat, he built a single shell, opposite of the wood use that was often done. So the color pattern was different. I think it was a darkened hull and light washboards or vice versa, but it was very distinctive. And so he was entered into this race in Putney, and it was an elimination race. And, you know, all the races, all the sculling races, you know, sculling is one man per boat or one woman per boat. They were always held on a Monday. And you know why that was? Because that's the only day the horses didn't run. And it was a big betting thing. So the people would come out and they would bet on rowing. So this was a moneyed race, and it was elimination. There were 58 entries, and you had elimination heats, and it got down to the final 4, and there was a prize for it. And George, 17-year-old George, was number 3 off the mark. It was a 2-second head start for the first guy, then 2 seconds, then George, and then 2 seconds ahead of the last guy. And in that foursome, the last guy off was the English champion, the defending English champion, and his name was Charles Harding. And his dad, Fred, gave George this advice just before he pushed off the dock. He said, quote, Wag Harding knows this course blindfolded. It's his native part of the river. Keep him directly astern, and you'll never need to look around where you're going. And that's exactly what he did. He was 2 seconds ahead, and he looked around, and if you scull, you do this, and you lose a quarter of a second. And he won by about a deck length. His prize money was 50 pounds. And, and this was before 1910. 50 pounds. When he got to the dock, his father, and bear in mind, all these people, everyone in my family that I knew, very proper Englishmen, just comport yourself, and you never talk, you never say anything. So his father was beside himself, jumping over the throat, and just reached down in the boat, hugging his son, almost fell in the river himself. And when they finally got up on the deck and told him exactly what was the source of his joy, he said, I bet 10 pounds on you. 20 to 1 odds.
Is that a moving seat?
What's that?
Was that a moving seat?
Yes, that was sliding seat.
Sliding seat.
Yeah.
Can you go back one?
Yeah.
Please? What does it mean? He had a 73-second start. 70-second start.
Yeah, I guess that's how they.
They staggered.
They staggered the starts somehow, and they had that handicap. But I've got this. What I gave you about this 2-second head starts was relying on this. These are George's unpublished memoirs. So his family persuaded him about 5 years before he died. You've got all these stories. Write them down. So this is what is this? This is 106 pages of single-spaced type. And the first copy I ever saw was on onion skin paper, the official type thing. So now, and this became the primary source for this, which is a 1986 biography of George Pocock called Ready All. It misspells his name on the cover, though. I wrote to the author and told him his name is Yeomans, but they said Yeoman, George Yeomans Pocock. But so there are wonderful stories. George is a fantastic storyteller. He was always in demand as an after-dinner speaker. But he tells that story about the 2-second head start. The Olympic race that the book is about, the movie's about, 1936. On their way home from Berlin, George and Francis went by Eton one last time, and they saw their father. It was the last time they saw their father alive. But he's got all these old mates that he grew up with and would build boats together with. And one of them said, George, that single you built back there when you were a teenager, that's still in the racks. would you like to see it? He said, oh, would I like to see it? Would you like to take it out? And George said, I have no togs. And that's, my grandmother used that phrase all the time, athletic stuff. I have no togs. We have togs. So he gave him shorts and a t-shirt, he took that out. In this memories, he devotes more time writing about this row on the Thames than he does on that gold medal race. And he said, oh, the memories, oh, the senses, the smells, oh. Let me just go back to this. I'll talk a little bit. I have too many stories for the time that we have, but I'm going to tell you a couple. These boys built boats for the men at Eton, and they were so good. Dick and George, they're teenagers, 18, 19 years old, tremendous boat builders and oarsmen. And they were commissioned by the wealthy parents of the boys that were there at Eton to build single shells. So my grandfather, before he turned 20 years old, he built a single shell for Anthony Eden, who became Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Crown Prince of Siam, who became the King of Siam. He's famous for a play they wrote about him. And Tom Sopwith, Sopwith Camel, and a guy named Cunard, steamship mountain, right? So all these sons were people that were built, my grandfather built the boats and taught them how to row. And a great recreational thing, Fred, 5 kids. And they worked 6 days, and on Sundays they had a day off. A great recreational thing was to take a 4 out on the Thames. And Julie was a stroke. She lived in New York. I knew her growing up. We always called her Auntie Ju. So Auntie Ju was in the stroke seat. Lucy was in number 3. Dick was in number 2. George was in number 1. Fred was in the coxswain seat with a little calf on his lap. And they would go, and they would love to catch up to the excursion steamships going up and down the river, and then race them. Pocock's always won, much to the delight of everybody on these boats. All right, so this is a picture of the guy who never, formal portrait of the guy who never liked this picture taken. This is a picture of my grandfather, Dick, Richard John Pocock, in his Doggett's coat and badge. And I'll tell you about the Doggett's coat and badge. That is a race that is raced every year since 1714. Thomas Doggett was an actor and a comedian in London, and he wanted to find out who the fastest boatman was in all of England, because he wanted to be able to summon that person when he needed a taxi cab on the water to get him. So he put up a sum of money and wrote up the rules and specified the Doggett's race. This is the oldest continually operating sporting event in the world, so far as we know. 1714, every year, even World War II years, they saved up the people from that year and they did them all when the war ended. So it still goes on today in August. You can race it once in your life, in the year that your apprenticeship ends. So you're 21 years old, and the rules of the race are, it starts at a certain bridge and it ends at a certain place in London. And river traffic is not to be interrupted. So if you've got barges out there, if you've got ferry boats, whatever you have, they just still go on. And the oarsmen need to just find their way around because he wanted to find out who the fastest and most skilled guy. And when you win this coat and you win this badge. This is a picture of the start of the race, 1910, when my grandfather won it. I'm going to tell you that in a minute. You beat me to it, Ian. This is Fred. This is my great grandfather. He was the starter of the race for 40 consecutive years. His title was Barge Master of the Company of Fishmongers. So we had to put that down. And Richard John Pocock won. There is his coat. His coat actually, since it belonged to my grandfather, belonged to my dad. Now I guess it belongs to me, but it's a custodian of the, there's a rowing museum that is still in limbo. Most of it's in storage on the South Shore somewhere in a warehouse. But they're trying to figure out where the National Rowing Museum is going to be. Probably wound up in down in Florida. Yeah. So that's the coat, and there's the badge. But here's the badge. This is used to hang in my grandfather's house. Now it hangs in my house. But here it is, and the title is "The Gift of Mr. Thomas Doggett, the late and famous comedian, in commemoration of King George's happy ascent to the throne of Great Britain, 1714." And Richard John Pocock. So you can all pass this around. I'll start with Ian since he knows the story. Okay, this is the ship that they came over on. In 1911, the boat building kind of dried up. Fred lost his job at Eton College. A couple of different reports on that. One was that he was not, it's a very hierarchical society, as you know. And people who had employees were supposed to treat them kind of harshly, and he never did. You're going to be tough on your men. He wasn't, and he just did not know how to play politics, so he was released from his Eton job. He tried to do boat building up and down the river. He bought a theater at one point, never worked. So these two young men, 21 and 20 years old, were out of work, didn't have anything to do. They determined that they had to go make their way somewhere else. And they had determined that they were going to go to Australia, because Australia had a lot of English immigration. They had rowing in Australia. And it was just before they were going to go to London and book passage that they had a caller come to their apartment. And this guy's name was I think I got it in my notes. Charlie Young. All right, Charlie Young comes, and George's memoirs describe Charlie Young in that visit. Quote, "He was fortified with strong drink." And they figured that he was coming to propose to Lucy. He was sweet on Lucy. So they're sitting around, two brothers, Charlie Young and somebody else, sitting around the small table in the kitchen, and they're talking. They talk about their plans to go to Australia. And Charlie Young says, I've got a cousin in Vancouver, British Columbia, sawing logs and making 10 pounds a week. And he left. He never got the courage to go in and talk to Lucy. And they're sitting around debriefing the conversation, and somebody said, drunken men often speak the truth. On the basis of that meeting, they changed their plans, went to London and bought a ticket for Halifax, and then across to Vancouver. And they came over on this boat. They went from London up to Liverpool, and then sailed over to Halifax. This was March 1911. What boat do you know went that same route exactly 1 year later? Yeah, it was the HMS Titanic, but it was the very same route 1 month earlier. Titanic went down in April. In fact, April 14th, right? April 14th, 1912, today. The brothers bought they brought tickets with winnings, and they had steerage. George was the youngest guy. He got the top bunk. He had an I-beam running right over his head. He said all night long rats were running up and down the I-beam. And the first night out, all the other classes got fed, and they finally brought the steerage people on up and fed them greasy sausages. And these two athletes knew, we're not going to eat this. This is terrible. So they just didn't. They didn't eat it. Next morning, everybody from steerage was up on the top deck, leaning over the rail, eating into the ocean. And, they were sick. And these two fairly affable guys, they got friendly with a steward who told them a day before they pulled into Halifax, 5-day crossing. They said, oh yeah, we give those greasy sausages first night out to the steerage, and everybody gets sick. We have to buy less food that way. So they got to Halifax, British citizens. They went into a tent that was on the dock. George describes a rather rather corpulent man sitting behind a makeshift table who, they went out the back of the tent in about 5 minutes, Canadian citizen. So got on a train, essentially, as they described it, it was like a boxcar with drop-down, beds on chains, no mattresses. And they said the trip across the country and the cross-country was worse than the trip in the steerage. So they got to Vancouver with, I think, $20 in their pocket. 2 young boat builders. There was English immigration there. There was a boat club, the Vancouver Boat Club. And it's already been established. If you've ever been to Vancouver, if you ever get there yet, beautiful city. There's a majestic spot. They have a wonderful clubhouse right at the head of Cole Harbor, very prominent spot. But this old rowing club, boat club, goes way back to before 1900. And this is what Vancouver looked like in those days. They had their first jobs. They took whatever work they could. George was on a crew going way up into the mountains of British Columbia, taking down trees and sawing lumber. And tragic thing happened there. He's 20 years old. He had never before worked on any kind of power equipment. And he was on a table saw and his soft piece of wood and sent his hand through the table saw. And he lost 2 fingers on his right hand, on his dominant hand. It was a tremendous disappointment in his life. He's very modest about it in his memoirs, but his son, my father's cousin Stan, would talk about it. Greatest disappointment of his life, because he would have gone all the way back from Vancouver for his year at the Doggett's race. And he didn't, and a guy that he beat repeatedly won the race that year. But there's a lot of pictures of George that you can find online. I dare you to find one where you can see that he's missing two fingers. But finally, Vancouver wrote, okay, we'll give you a commission for 2 singles. And they said, we'll pay you $200 for 2 singles. Well, they said, okay, do you have any place that we can work? And I said, well, we can sell you this floating shop. Cost them $100 for that. And the rest of the 100 was basically buying materials and supplementing whatever tools that they needed. They brought over a lot of tools, and I still have my grandfather's tools. I have incredible ivory T-square with his initial stamped P in it. Beautiful. So stuff, and a lot of it, still works perfectly. So this is where the first boats in America built at Pocock were built, in the middle of Vancouver Harbor. And it was tethered, it had an anchor, it had a chain, but it would rise and fall with the tides. And usually when it fell, it landed on hard bottom, and then it would come up. Sometimes it got stuck in the mud. And they would talk about the fact that sometimes it stuck in the mud, and the tide would come up, and one end of the shop would come up, and the water would be rushing in, and they had a loft, they had a little ladder, that's where they slept. They just would retreat up the ladder and wait for the inevitable to happen, and the thing would, the pressure would be so great it would release it, so it would come up like a surfacing submarine. Water would run out the doors at either end, and they'd get down and resume fine woodworking. So, one day they were working in their shop and they saw this man coming rowing to them in a single. It was a bit of a chop, but not terrible conditions. And whichever brother saw him called the other one to the window, look at this guy. And they figured that, okay, he's making his way to us. So they gaffed him in, and he introduced himself as Hiram Conybeare, the rowing coach at the University of Washington. And the brothers didn't believe it. They saw him row. So they thought that he must be also fortified with strong drink. So what happened, and I've heard this story from them, my grandfather, Dick, would talk to him, and he'd explain what he was doing, and engage him, very properly, look him right in the eye, have a conversation. George went around behind to sort of sniff to see if he could smell his breath. And he's behind him, and he said, no. Okay, they figured, okay, must be who he said he was. He told them that he had an order for 12 8-oared shells down at the University of Washington. could they move down to Seattle and build a show? And he left, they talked about it, they said, we've got to go check this out. They did. They determined that something was going to happen. That's a heck of a lot of work. They sent for their father, who was still out of work. So Fred came from London with Lucy. And when he arrived in Halifax, Conager told the boys, you know, I thought I had money for 12. I only have money for 1. So they cabled their father. He said, well, I'm coming anyway. This guy was a tremendous motivator. He was a football trainer. He actually worked for the Chicago Bears, right? And he was at University of Washington, and they said, could you coach the crew program? He said, yes, of course I could. He knew nothing about it. So he read books, he took whatever courses he could. He went to the biology department and got a skeleton and strapped him onto a seat and look how the bones would move. He did all kinds of stuff. So Nick and George would say this guy's a tremendous motivator and innovator, but essentially they taught him how to row. And everybody captured what all the Ivies were doing at the time. It was a big lay-back stroke. As you finish, you'd lay way back. And they'd say, this is not the Thames Waterman stroke, you know. It's basically, my father would describe it, it's 11 to 1, 11 to 1. It's the greatest efficiency. So they went on down, they built boats, they built that one. Fred came over. The first 8 that was ever built in America by a Pocock was built by my grandfather Dick and his father Fred, while George was up in Vancouver finishing some orders. This was 1912. They came over in 1911, this is 1912. 1913, they come to Poughkeepsie. The IRA, International Collegiate Regatta, was in Poughkeepsie every year. And they came out with a Pocock boat, and they finished 3rd to, I think it was Cornell and either Syracuse or Navy. Nobody expected them to finish. They realized, hey, we belong. We're good. So that was basically sort of the rise of University of Washington rowing. Okay, that's 1913. The rest of the world got into a world war a couple of years later. World War I. The U.S. didn't get into that war until, I think it was 1917. One day, so boat building had dried up, and one day the president of University of Washington comes into the boat building shop with this man, and he says, Bill, these are the brothers I want you to meet. And he introduces them, and there was a finished 8-oar shell sitting in their shop, and this guy Bill got down on his hands and knees underneath, and he looked up and he said, this is the kind of workmanship that I've been looking for. Gave him his card, said, come and see me at your earliest convenience. And he left, and they looked at his card, and he said, William E. Boeing, aeroplanes. Right? So this is Bill Boeing. This is the start of the Boeing company. So they finished up their work. It was a couple of months later, they went to see him. This is his shop. And to see him, if you ever go to Seattle, or if you've been to the Museum of Flight, which Boeing Company runs, this building is an artifact in their museum. This is the largest artifact. This is bigger than a 747. It's the largest artifact. And you can go in this building, which is where my grandfather and Dick started their career with Boeing. And here's what he said. He said he had a contract for 50 of these planes. This is the first commercial plane that he built. And he said, my problem is the pontoons. They're too heavy, they fill with water, they keep breaking. Can you build me these pontoons? They said, show us the plans. He did. He said, yeah, this is a pretty simple looking job, we can do it. And he said, how much would they weigh? They did some calculations, say 115 pounds each. He said, if you can build me 2 of these for 115 pounds, I will give you each a new hat. And in 3 days, they called him and said, we got the pontoons finished, come and inspect. And Mr. Boeing came, they called for a scale. First one was 116 pounds. Second one was 114 pounds. And so they got a job. But, George's memoir, we never got the hats. I was, shortly after this book came out, I was doing this talk, or much earlier version of this talk, in Wenham, or Hamilton, at a club up there. And afterwards, the guy came up to me and he said, I worked for the Boeing Aircraft Company my entire career. On behalf of the company, I want to apologize. and then he found me. He found me a couple of months later at something, and he gave me 2 hats. So this one says, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. I don't know if anybody wear that hat today. This is a picture of the pontoon shop. That's my grandfather on the far right. All of these pictures I have are from about 1920, 1921, 1922, early pictures of the Boeing Aircraft Company, including this photo. And George and Dick were told, hire whoever you want. They hired 12 people and build pontoons for these 50 planes plus 50 spares. And they called them after a short time, said, okay, job is finished, 150 pontoons built. They turned out a couple of pontoons a day. And they had 150 finished before the first airframe was finished. And Boeing said, what's wrong here? And asked George, as George was the more systems guy, he could figure out how to organize a job like this to get it done. So George, would you go into the final assembly plant and figure out what's wrong? And he did, 27-year-old George. Went in there and he knew nothing about airplanes, but he knew everything about wood. Everything on this plane is built by wood except for the engine, including the propeller. And he just noticed, okay, these holes should be drilled before this assembly, not after this assembly, things like that. And so at age 27, Boeing made him foreman of the final assembly plant. My grandfather was foreman of the pontoon plant. Boeing sent George all around the country to rival airfields. Wichita was a big center, and New York was a big center, to see what everybody else was doing and come and make notes like that and come back and report. So that was their early history with Boeing aircraft. World War I ended. Boeing's contracts kind of dried up. He tried to build boats, did other things. He did not want to fold up the company, kept down to 30 people. They didn't have any sort of contracts. And so Dick and George were still employed. They just spent time in Boeing shop building 8-oar shells, building boats. And this is one of 2 boats that were built in Boeing shop in 1920. And a House committee from Washington, D.C. was touring around to all the post-war aircraft companies to see who they wanted to award contracts with. And they came out to Washington, to Seattle, and came into the shop. No airplanes, just plans. And the chairman of the committee said, who built these? Look at this boat. And Boeing said, oh, these brothers who work for us built this. And the guy looked at the boat and he said, you know, I rode at Harvard. I have never seen craftsmanship quite like this. Let me meet those boys. And so they came out and stood around for a half an hour talking about nothing other than rowing. And everybody else on the committee just one foot and then the other. On the basis of that, Boeing got the contract for a certain amount of pursuit planes. And Boeing's history, you know, that's the point that they took off. So that was really about the end of their career for Boeing aircraft. It was about 1920 and 1921. They went into the fellow, my grandfather, we went into Bill's office and said, we want to get back to our first love. We want to build boats. They didn't have any contracts. They didn't have any prospects, but this is what we do. We want to build boats. And so they resigned. And Boeing said to them, I can't thank you enough. You helped establish this company. I cannot pay you what you're worth. And but here's what I'll do. And he paid them with Boeing stock. Right. The company had just gone public the year before. Here they are, paid with Boeing stock. Here is the tale of 2 families, my people. George never sold his stock. My grandfather, Jesse, came over. My grandmother, they were married. My Uncle Johnny was born in 1920 in Seattle. And the reason I'll tell you in a minute, they moved to New Haven. They moved to New Haven, sold their stock, built a house, very fine house in Milford, Connecticut. But George was not married, really did not need, well, he held on to his stock for a long time. So they were well set in Seattle, let me tell you. In 1921, this man came, or Yale University came west, and this was the coach. His name was Edmund Leader, and they wanted to recruit him to Yale. Would you come and coach rowing at Yale? And he said, I will come on one condition. Of course, Yale could pay a lot more than Washington. I'll come on one condition, that one of the Pococks come with me. And that's how my grandfather, with a young family, decided to come to New Haven, and the brothers then split. These brothers are tremendously connected, 3,000 miles separating them most of their working lives, but tremendous love, tremendous camaraderie. But one on the East Coast, one on the West. And so Dick Pocock, my grandfather, came, sold their stock, built a wonderful home, and he had a contract with Yale. His contract was to build one 8-oared shelf for Yale per year, and that was it. He could build smaller boats, do what he wanted with them, but he had a non-compete clause. He could not build an 8 for anybody else. And so his total output in his career was 46 boats. And George's boats, all George's boats have names on them, usually after the benefactor. Dick's boats just had Roman numeral numbers on the boats. And this is the Olympic crew in 1924. He started building boats in 1921. They were undefeated. Yale was undefeated for 5 years. They beat everybody. The powerhouses, other than the Ivies, were Navy and Syracuse and Wisconsin to a certain extent. But they drubbed them. And everybody said, it's this incredible equipment that you have. Where can we get this equipment? Unfortunately, not at Yale, but you could get it in Seattle. And so our side of the family contends that that's how George's business was built. And they actually think the same thing. So in 1924, they were getting ready, they have a 4-miler with Harvard on the Thames River in New London every year. And they were at Gales Ferry, Harvard trains at Red Top. They were getting ready for that race. And they said, the Olympic trials are down in Philly just the week before. Should we go down there? Yeah, let's go down. And Navy was expected to win the whole thing. So kind of on a spur, they kind of voted, yeah, let's try it. So they went down and they won the Olympic trials in a sprint race down in Philadelphia. Came back and the next week beat Harvard in a 4-miler. So this is Paris Olympics, 1924. Summer Olympics this year, Paris, 2024, 100 years later. My grandfather's in the back row, third from the left. And he built the boat. This was boat number 4. Here is the captain. This shows you again the popularity of rowing. Right? The captain of the team is on the cover of Time magazine. This is, his name is Rockefeller. Right? Contrast with the 1936 crew and the story, these guys, Joe Rance and these people depression. So James Stillman Rockefeller is captain. He marries Nancy Carnegie, right? Andrew Carnegie's niece. This is the caliber, and the number 7 in that boat was Benjamin Spock. He wrote a book, Baby and Child Care. So they won. Here's the X's over Spock. He was a substitute. Guy got sick, and he was put in the boat at the last minute. But they won easily in Paris. Here's the guy who built every other boat for every other college. By the early 1940s, every single boat in Poughkeepsie on the Hudson River, all 30-some boats were built by George Pocock. This is Western Red Cedar in 1927. He switched from building imported Spanish cedar to Western Red Cedar because he saw these canoes that the First Nations people would build 100 years ago that were still good. No rock whatsoever, perfectly seaworthy, and he was told by a lot of the native people, try to work with this stuff, so he loved it. he would actually go out into the woods. He liked Oregon better than Washington or British Columbia, with the sawyers to select the tree. And he would look for at least 30 feet of no knots whatsoever. He would have them hewn into blocks, and he would store those blocks for 3 years, seasoning them up, and then have them milled down and then plane them down the distance. So a 62-foot 8-oared shell was 3 pieces of cedar on each side. A single shell, 26 feet, as you saw. That's just one piece. I'll tell you, there's a guy in Port Townsend, Washington, that still built, he's got all the old Pocock jigs and everything. Stan gave them to him. And he still builds a single this way. But he cuts them down to 3/16 of an inch on a saw, and then hand planes them to 3/32. And that's what you're 3/32 of an inch. And that's the hull on a. And I think he said, Rick, you can't put your foot through. But a lot of feet went through. In fact, the boat that won the Olympics, a couple of days before the race, somebody was looking at it, picked up their head, put a crack in it, and fixed it. Look at this record. Every year from 1920 to 1956, the United States won the gold medal in the men's eights. And it was built in a Pocock. 1960 was when it finished. It was Navy, and they didn't even medal. And then after that, it was composite crews. The oarsmen were all selected from different. So, but this is. So you see, Cal won 3 times. Yale won twice. UW had that one. So this is a picture of the crew from the book and the movie. They had reunions every 10 years. This is the last year. This is 40 years on. Last year that all of them were alive. They would come out, they would take the Husky Clipper down and take it on out. And here's the finish of the race. Now, I'll tell you, Dan Brown in the book does a fantastic job describing this race. The beginning of the race, they gave the U.S. the worst lane. They gave Germany and Italy the best lanes, even though they had the worst qualifying times. So they were punishing the U.S. Tremendous wind coming off at an open spot there. So it probably cost them a couple of boat lanes. My great uncle George talked to me about this race, and he said, you see the stands there, and I'm going to show you the next slide. Here's the race course. There's where the wind would come, and the wind was blowing from left to right, and it would have a big chop in lane number 6. But the last 500 meters were in those stands, those artificial stands constructed out in the river. And UW came just a little bit past the last oar, right up against that. And Uncle George said that the wind was completely blocked by those stands for the last 500 meters. He said, I think that flat water there was worth 10 seconds. And the chop was then in lanes 1 and 2 for the last 500 meters. First 1,500 meters were terrible. But that last 500 meters, and they won by 0.6 of a second. So it is interesting on that. I didn't bring Aunt Frances, George's wife. She had a diary of the entire Olympic experience, and it was an epistolary diary. She wrote letters home every single day to her 2 children, starting with the Olympic trials in Princeton, Princeton, going all the way through this. And I've got a cousin out there who typed it all up, so I have it digital. And she wrote about the gold medal race. And she writes a paragraph about this much. She said, yeah, gold medal race, well, UW, they got a slow start, but we won. And she spent more time talking about who they had dinner with that night. If you go to University of Washington, you can go in the shell house, the Coney Bear shell house, and the Husky Clipper is hanging over the dining room. And there it is, and that is That's a sticker on every one of George's boats, and all of you who rode in those wooden shells, you recognize that sticker, don't you? There was a time when that sticker said, Pocock Racing Shells, building boats to build mankind.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yes.
And that's my Uncle George. He viewed, he was a great boat builder, but he was a builder of, you know, as he said, pardon me, a builder of men. I mean, I'm sure he would say men and women now. But it was his way of raising up people to their best in building this equipment and in coaching them. And he put it right on a sticker, building boats to build mankind. And he loved it. So this, you know, this, those of you who've been in these boats, you recognize, and he would often say, everybody alike is going to be, you know, they're all going to have the same equipment, they'll also all be fit. I want to give an edge to my crew, so I'm going to make it beautiful. You know, he could make it just functional, but he wanted to make it beautiful too, so there's matching woods and the two-tone seats that he did. Here's Joe Rance's letter sweater hanging up there. This is a picture of Joe Rance just a couple of months before he died, holding his gold medal. And there's me and Judy Rance and Daniel James Brown. The story here is Judy Rance Willman, caring for her father, dying of congestive heart failure. He died, I think, in 2009, something like that. He moved to her house, and she said, "Dad, you know, we've been talking these stories all our lives. I'm going to write them down." And she just kind of chronicled the stories of his life, and had 9 pages of single space, and said, "I think I want to write a book about this." And her husband said, "Well, why don't you go talk to our neighbor? I think Dan over there, I think he's a writer. Why don't you?" And so across the field, across the stone fence, she went over to Daniel James Brown, said, "Could you read this? Tell me what you think. You know, do I have a book?" 7:30 the next morning, he knocked on the door. "Not only do you have a book, but I encourage you to write this book. If you choose not to, would you permit me to write it?" And that's how this book came to be. A guy who knows nothing about rowing then. So he is the author, and she is the source. She, you know, if you know that every chapter in the book has a heading, a quote of George Pocock's. Well, Judy Rance picked all those out. And so that's how it came to be, and that's the partnership. The Ready All, 1986 biography of George. And this is a woman on the left, that's my second cousin, Katie Kuski. I don't know who that guy is. And here's George in 1936. That's what he looked like. You know, the movie portrays him, he's a guy playing in his 70s, but this is, George was 45 at the time of that Olympic race. And here he is with the crew, and the big wreath. And that's the guy that I knew. You know, an older man in his life, we would see him every single year when he came east. He visited with us, took great interest in me as a boy growing up. And so that would be it. End of talk.